Thank you, Philip, for that wonderful introduction. I just want to say, well, a few random things before I get started and jump into the body of the presentation. One, present the presentation of speakers has been amazing and wonderful. So thank you all. You probably presented this talk better than I'm going to be able to present it in a much longer winded version of it. So I thank you for that. I'm also thinking a lot about the way that there have been themes that have been emerging and running through all of these papers, not all of which or any of which I'm going to try to synthesize in their totality, but which I would like to remark on a little bit today as they intersect with the topic that I will be speaking on. We've talked a lot about spectrality, about ghosts, about phantasmas, as we've also tried to think about the virtuality of touch. There's this kind of paradox that seems to be emerging where we want to talk about how touch becomes virtualized, becomes instantiated into these spaces, and yet we're still talking about it in a way that seems to be eliding its physicality in some ways. I'm especially reminded of that here in this room as we come in, since it was 98 degrees or, I don't know, 34 Celsius on the first day. And the room continues to seem to hold the heat memory of 2 days ago. So we're very much reminded of these bodily encounters. And no matter how much the spectral quality of these things holds, at their base, the materiality is always present. And our bodies and the intersections of our bodies with those things are always present, despite the ways these things become complicated. And some of those complications I'll talk about. But I really, lots of ghostly things happening with machines today. With Marin's talk was excellent, and I'm glad she mentioned holograms as well. So we'll come back to that a little bit. Another side comment, and these are kind of side comments because I just haven't had time to write them out, is a little reflection on my title of my talk. So I've played around with the title of this talk. I'm not exactly sure what I want to call it. I landed on phantom figures, and I want to pull on that just a little bit, and it'll come out a little more in the talk as well. When I'm using this term phantom, I am referring to it using the term in a couple ways. One, to elicit kind of this response or recognition of the ghostliness of holograms, both optical, digital, and haptic. But also to think about the double meaning of them as apparitions, apparent things that are apparent without substance, evoking the idea of figments of our imagination as well. There's many connotations that phantom has. Additionally, figures, it's not the perfect word. Like the figure is great in providing connotations about bodies and shapes, which is something that haptic holograms do. It also provides connotations to numerals and models, the computational underpinning of haptic holograms. The work it doesn't do for me, which I would like it to do, is represent physicality. So maybe there's a better word for that. And maybe it's just that I have a really problematic relationship to alliteration, and I like to use it. So as you can see, it's an alliterative title, and I enjoy that. The second part of this, encounters of the haptic hologram kind of gets at what I'll get at later, which is haptic holograms as a type of kind of alien encounter or an encounter with things that we haven't encountered before. The final note I want to make, well, two final notes I want to make before getting in. I really appreciate the invitation to come and talk at this conference. I hadn't heard of Bookham before I came here, which is unfortunate for me. But having said that, I doubt that you've heard of Houghton, Michigan. So, you know, we share equal responsibility in our lack of knowledge of places. What is fascinating to me, I am not a Flusser scholar. So the way that I'm going to be using Flusser, feel free to challenge, push back. I'd like to learn more. What I have learned in learning more about Flusser, though, is that the last set of seminars that he gave was here in Bochum. So I find that to be a very interesting intersection and connection. That was in 1991. Maybe, was anybody around then? Okay, no. Well, I didn't know. You never know. Okay. So the other thing I want to say is that this work, while I'm going to be presenting it, is very much in collaboration with my colleague Thomas Connor, who is currently at the University of Tulsa. Thomas is really the expert in holograms. And so what has brought us together for this project is a few years ago, we saw some things in the news about haptic holograms. And I reached out and I said, hey, I do stuff on haptics, you do stuff on holograms. Let's do a collaboration together. And so we've been working on this project for several years now in different iterations and starts and stops. But Thomas unfortunately couldn't be here, but he is working on a book project called Looking Through You, Digital Holograms and the New Material Image. And there's his website information if you want to learn any more about Thomas and Thomas's work. So, to dig in, have you ever felt the desire to touch out, to feel a hologram, or perhaps a 3D object in virtual space? If you tried Simon Spizer's, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, Touching Clouds exhibit, you've probably tried that, and maybe you've come up empty-handed. You are, of course, not alone. But what are we attempting to touch when we try to touch a hologram? It's an extension of questions asked about purely visual 3D imagery for decades. Even in the 1960s and 70s, when scientists and artists gazed upon optical holograms, which are highly exact replications or representations of diffracted objects, they wondered, what are we really looking at? It's not the object itself, even though it's an exact replay of the light reflected from it. It's not an interpretive representation created by the hand of an artist either. It's something else, something new. That something else, something new, manifests as a ghostly quality of holographic imagery, beckoning the spectator to reach out, to try and touch the object, an instinctual gesture that always fails. The viewer's hand only ever finds a phantom. And I'm not going to go deeper into the work of how this relates to Flusser's gesture, theory of gesture, but that very much is part of a larger project and paper that we are working on as well. If holograms, by virtue of their spatial appearance, trigger a gestural response in spectators, an impulse to reach out and touch, then adding haptics to holograms attempts to close the circuit, producing a felt encounter with an apparition. But this desire is not just produced by the appearance of the hologram, it is affiliated with the cultural project of haptics. To paraphrase David Parisi from an interview with Ali Mullaroni in 2018, as an industry, haptics positions itself as a response to discourses about digital objects being inherently ephemeral. Therefore, quote, we'll see haptics become part of a counter trend back to rematerialization, where touch technology will be used to give virtual objects an apparent physicality, end quote. Indeed, starting at least as early as the late 90s and possibly before, hapticians have been experimenting with ways of imbuing holograms specifically with a physicality accessible to fingertips and hands. And perhaps, if you, for people that are more willing to experiment as participants, other body parts as well. In fact, coming from an early project that started around 1998 at the MIT Media Lab, I pull this quote from a researcher who did some early work, and I'm going to show a little bit of that work in just a minute. The group led by Wendy Plesniak says here, good holograms are bewitching. They command our eyes to their images, to search the marvelous realness of surfaces, textures, and minute detail for some aberration, some visual clue that will dissuade us from seeing as real what we know is not. Yet while they seem to assemble the very molecules of matter, physical matter, for us to ponder, they also present a conundrum. The objects they render appear frozen, lifeless, and confounding to our fingertips. What if we could render these images animate and touchable, as phantom material that was both dynamic and plastic? It's a provocation. It's a provocation that motivates Plesniak's technical work, and it's a provocation that also motivates our work as well. To answer that question, so to face up to such a provocation, we've brought together theories of haptic media and philosophies of images, especially that again of Husserl, his concept of the technical image, and his own thinking on embodiment and gesture, in order to posit the notion of what we call the technical material. The projection of 3D objects into space visually and now also haptically mixes up ideas, representations, and experiences about images and objects. Just as viewing a digital image means viewing a computed abstraction, what these systems calculate and produce as felt phantoms does a similar thing. The resulting new experiences are of something other than a hologram or even an image, and other than a physical object. They offer unique liminal spaces for the production of novel sensory encounters and technosensory cultural constructions. Like many theorists looking at media historically, Flusser divides human communication into pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras. In his case, he ascribes a specific dominant mode of communication to each one. Pre-modernity was dominated by what he called traditional images, anything made by the hand. Modernity has been dominated by writing, according to Flusser, and with the arrival of photography in the early 1800s, we've since been experiencing the emergence of a new dominant code of communication, what he calls the technical image. This refers to images generated through technical apparatuses like cameras or computers, but maybe, as Wanda Straven pointed out in her talk on Wednesday, looms, which would kind of like contest all of the anti-materialism that Flusser's offering here. Unlike traditional images, which represent the external world, technical images project new models and ideas into the world. Flusser saw this not as mimetic, but as inventive. One helpful way of looking at or through this is Daniel Ergeng's perspective on Flusser's technical image, in which he specifies that the technical image is associated with what Flusser called a new imagination, which Ergeng reframes as projective imagination. This is not a situation for reproducing existing reality, but about constructing new, unseen possibilities. So the technical image is not merely a new way of depicting existing reality. Instead, it embodies and enacts a new mode of human imagination, which Daniel Ergeng, Siegfried Zielinski, and others call this projective imagination, which allows humans to construct, propose, and actualize new realities through technical mediation. They're essentially describing augmented reality in some senses. The ideas that in our heads aren't just written down or modeled into 2D representations, they're actually projected into some form that materializes them, embodying the concept to the point that it becomes a pre-thing in real space, a spectral presence, something that's with us more than an idea, but maybe not quite so much as a physical body. This is what we think is happening with the creation of haptic holograms. Image objects that project not just a visual concept, but an imaginary of touch. One second, I gotta take a drink. That was not my water. Okay, because it has gas, that's how I know the difference. Anyway, to turn these images of touch into something touchable, then it's necessary to ask, what are we touching when we touch haptics? To get at this question, especially to bridge the untouchable touchability of the hologram with an attempt to materialize something that makes the hologram not quite solid, but at least physical, I think it's worth considering two perspectives on haptics. The first perspective comes from art historians and cinema studies scholars. And here again, I'm going to admit that I'm not a cinema studies scholar, so there are people who know this stuff much better than me, but I am also using it in a somewhat essentialized way, in a way that I think and hope works for these arguments. But the scholars I'm talking to are people like Laura Marks, Riegel, Burke, and Lant. I am admittedly going to be a bit reductive here to make a point and for the sake of time, but also because the reductions get at the essential qualities I think are most useful in understanding the relationships in these cases. The use of the term haptic by these scholars essentially takes two distinct paths. The first suggests that imagery, still or moving, is haptic when it evokes an affective tactile response in the observer. For instance, every time I see a movie, and I probably some of you have experienced this as well, and you see somebody falling down, my legs tingle immediately. And some of you have probably had that experience as well, or just seeing that happen to somebody, outside your window, a kid falling off a bike or something. The second suggests that the haptic aspects of images are tied to their spatial illusions, turning a visual encounter into a touched encounter, not because the viewer can touch the object, but precisely because they can imagine the tactile qualities of those objects that could be touched. From this perspective, we might say that holograms are always already haptic. But what is touched in this version then is a subjective, internalized experience of touch without touching, related to what I would call having touched before, where the image evokes a sense of tactility because of prior touch-oriented experiences. But the haptics we are touching when we touch haptic holograms is more than this. They involve the construction of haptic interfaces that grow out of psychophysical experiments and practices thoroughly documented by David Parisi in his book, Archaeologies of Touch, that articulate touch as scientifically measurable and programmable, capable of being physicalized and reformatted through technological means. And in doing so, I argue, capable of offering a projective material imaginary of a never having touched before experience. This is an image of a phantom, and I'll come back to this in just a second. Um, an early attempt at haptic holography that predates the cases we will focus on incorporates, in other words, these are cases that are not midair haptics, and maybe would be more closely associated with optical holograms, but which incorporates haptics, emerges from this tradition. Wendy Plesniak of the Spatial Imaging Group at MIT Media Lab used a version of the Phantom, which you saw there before, which is a haptic stylus that provides force feedback. So when you map it onto some virtual space and you touch it, it gives you a force sense through the stylus. So I don't think this video is going to work, so I'll just leave it like this. But the Spatial Imaging Group used the Phantom, a force feedback stylus system, also designed at MIT and seen in this slide, to explore the possibility of creating physical materials that could be reprogrammed, reconfigured, and rearranged in the same way that bytes were almost infinitely manipulatable in the computational architecture of a computer. So if this video would work, it is demonstrating one of their attempts at doing this, creating a haptic, a lathe, a virtual lathe using haptic holography, where if the video were operating, what you would see is that this person is using the Phantom to touch this hologram, and the hologram is responding, and it becomes manipulatable in real space. And for them, they are feeling some kind of force feedback from that image. And by giving it some kind of physical sensation, and actually more of a physical sensation than the midair haptics that I'll be talking about in just a moment. The thing about this version of haptic holograms, though, is that the haptic encounter is moored to a grounded haptic device. You need to touch the pen to touch the hologram. The mediating haptic device clearly making itself known as another object in the encounter with the haptic image. Another version of this would be something you could do now with a more recent haptic interface or haptic gloves that also use force feedbacks and other kinds of force mechanisms. And so, for instance, if you had done the touching cloud exhibit and the artist had decided they wanted to apply haptics to this, they could have put gloves on your hands, and you could have reached out and felt some kind of feedback from those rocks that you were swinging around. But again, this is also another example of this kind of grounded form of haptics where the glove itself becomes the mediating thing, the thing you're touching, not the hologram. But emerging holograms use other haptic interfaces which unground the body from any specific device and create a more liminal space of the encounter. These haptic holograms, which share the media specificity of using ungrounded haptics to provide physicality, anchor the theoretical work of this project. Our work thus far is based on several cases during the last decade in which haptic holograms have been created, to one degree or another, always in labs, almost never commercially available outside, sometimes tried in a few museum exhibits. It's been done via a wide variety of approaches to computing and projecting the sense of touch. These are scientists and students out there making haptic holograms with a wide spectrum of materials and technologies one would expect to encounter at the earliest experimental stages of a developing system. So much of this is speculative in some ways. I'll show and summarize 4 of these for you as a means of showcasing what's on offer, as well as how our initial thinking is taking shape according to the development of these projects. So in this first video that I'll start playing, it's called Fairy Lights. Just as optical holograms began with the invention of laser light in the 60s, our first case of adding haptics to a 3D image object is a system that uses contemporary lasers to project tiny glowing images that float in physical space. No screens, no visual projectors, just points of light that form shapes you can see and even feel. I'm going to stop that. Deal. Yeah, this is the result of research by a team at the University of Tsukuba in Japan, which has been presented in several conferences. The conference paper is titled Fairy Lights in Femtoseconds. These researchers developed a system that uses ultra-short laser pulses known as femtosecond lasers to create tiny points of light they call voxels in midair. These lasers are incredibly fast and precise, which allows them to excite air molecules at specific points, producing visible light without any physical medium. The excitement produces 2 sensations. The light, which can be directed into the form of an object, but also an ionization of the air that can be felt as a minute vibration. Since the laser pulses are so precisely focused, they ionize air molecules, creating a plasma burst, essentially a tiny shock wave of energy that can be felt at a tactile stimulus. So just like a real hologram, your hand reaches out and still fails to encounter an actual material surface, but you're touching something. You're touching manipulated air and you're feeling more than air. Okay. Struggling with this video. Um, the next project, branded Ultra Haptics, uses sound to create a feeling of touch in midair. This system, developed by researchers at the University of Bristol's Department of Computer Science and Mechanical Engineering, is billed as one to be coupled with a separate visual system and used when augmenting an interactive surface. And you kind of see this at the end. The place that they've used this most is actually not with visuals, but to project just haptics into midair space to replace like buttons in cars. It hasn't been very effective. By precisely controlling ultrasonic waves, this system can generate localized points of haptic feedback via an array of featuring 256 ultrasonic transducers operating at 40 kilohertz. Essentially, tactile sensations that users can feel on their bare hands as they move them through the air above an interactive surface. Multiple points can be controlled simultaneously, which allows for more complex haptic patterns and sensations that can change in real time as the user moves their hands. So this system could generate the mid-air feeling of pressing a virtual button or feeling a textured surface, again, generating a type of tactile sensation. Given the lack of commercial availability in all of these projects, accounts of what these haptic holograms feel like, though, is lacking. But some limited evidence from encountering mid-air haptics without visuals suggests people feel patterns, sorry, feel patterns produced as what they refer to as vibration, mild, not natural, unusual, magic, blowing feeling, hand dryer, and gust of wind. So some exciting descriptions there. And I have not, unfortunately, been able to feel this device myself, but David Parisi has, and he also mentioned that like what you are kind of feeling when you feel it is like, yeah, you kind of feel like you're feeling something might be there, but then you just kind of pass through it and it's kind of gone and the sensation is gone. And so there's no real like pushback like you would get from forces or something. So in that way, it's the phantomness of it is still kind of apparent. Another example of these efforts is a project, and I'm not going to play this one, at the University of Glasgow and its Bendable Electronics and Sensing Technologies Research Group. In this recent experiment, a volumetric hologram is displayed and positioned within the available space of the device using glass and mirrors. As the spectator reaches into the space, their hand is tracked by a camera, and tiny jets of air are directed toward its surface and its fingers when they approach the location space where the object is depicted. The researchers labeled the experience in their experiment as aerohaptics and claim that it can simulate a feeling of touch. They claim to be able to create the feeling of a ball, which can be touched, as well as rolled and bounced, although I would have to say that this very much relies on semiotic triangulation, like David had mentioned as well. Like you have to give these words to this sensation and this image in order to create this connotative connection. In addition, the system is able to deliver a quote, are able to, quote, deliver haptic feedback of varying intensities, end quote, by adjusting the strength of air jets. Quote, large and quick movements produce a strong haptic feedback, which corresponds to a harder hit on the ball. A more subtle movement results in a weaker air burst, replicating a softer touch to the ball, end quote. And the final project, which is interesting because it sits somewhere in the middle of grounded and ungrounded haptics. So I'm not exactly sure what we're going to make of it, but I think it leans more towards the ungrounded side and more towards the midair, which is why I'm including it. Is a project that gained a lot of headlines just a couple months ago. It's what's called the Flexible, and I'll just play a little bit of that and then talk about it. Oh, we're going to watch a commercial. So while the commercial is going on and you're watching cats, no, it's almost done. Okay, there we go. So, so this has a different and much more material take on producing haptic interaction with digital content. And this is actually one of the only experimental models that really provides this ability to move the hologram in kind of the way that is harkens back to Plesniak's work on haptic holography in the late 1990s. The interaction in this case is with a flexible vibrating surface known as a diffuser. Traditional diffusers like this are rigid and can be hazardous if touched, but Flexible employs an elastic diffuser that safely deforms upon contact, allowing users to interact haptically with the imagery it displays. The system tracks hand movements, enabling users to grab, rotate, or move virtual objects. For instance, one can sorry, one can pinch a floating cube between their fingers or simulate walking by moving their fingers across the display, like you saw. And this system comes out of Public University of Navarra in Spain. That is all of the cases that we've looked at so far. So what are we touching then when we touch haptic holograms? This will be when I wrap up. These systems are each fairly distinct denotatively. They are sound technologies and lasers and blown air and programmable fabrics. In other words, there is a medium specificity here that may require further consideration. But there are some connotations to the larger projects of haptic holography, we would argue, which seems to be unfolding around the world in these experimental spaces. It's a transformation that signals a shift from passive visualization to active materialization, where representations are no longer simply seen, but encountered through touch, spatial presence, and physical response. Haptic holography via various displays introduces a new paradigm in which digital constructs interact with the body directly, bypassing traditional screens or symbols. Importantly, this is not necessarily a reflexive project. Even as each of these projects attempts to program representations of the world into their systems, that is, creating a ball for you to grab or a surface for you to touch, these digital materializations are not turning these representations back into their objects. They're turning those objects into a different kind of representation. These are not simulations of materiality. They are new materialities, emergent forms whose status blurs the line between the virtual and the real. Experiences like these collapse distinctions between interface and environment and suggest that what we once called an image has now become more of an event, temporal, spatial, and affective. Since the original gesture of optical holography did not include haptics, these new digital experiences are of something other than a hologram, and not even an image, but perhaps something new and different entirely. Building on Flusser's idea of the technical image as a projection of concepts rather than a reproduction of objects, these technologies offer a medium for materializing the projective imagination in real time, thus articulating a technical material rather than merely a technical image. The image ceases to be a window or a mirror or even a surface controlled by buttons and becomes a physicalized phantom, a site where the socio-technical mining of the body, algorithmic attention, cultural curation, and subjective human perception meet. These technical materials open space then to generate, project, and physicalize imaginaries of the never having felt before. And that's the end. Thanks.